Python is known for being a great programming language, right? Great for beginners, great for experts alike. There's a package to accomplish everything that you need. So it can make you feel really powerful and useful. But if you've used Python for any amount of time, you've likely ran into issues with dependencies, with packages conflicting, with virtual environments and requirements.txt and just trying to get the whole thing to work. And there's some weird C lib that this thing depends on and you can't get it working and you just want to pull your hair out. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But why is that, right? Why is dependencies such a challenge in Python? And like, there are compiled languages where this seems to be less of a problem, right? You don't see these complaints with Java, which is, compiled but JITted. You don't see these complaints with Rust or Go. So is it something to do with the dynamic nature of Python being interpreted? But there's dynamic interpreted languages that have less problems, right? Node has packages, Ruby has packages, and there seems to be less issues. So what's going on here and how do we address it? So today I want to show an answer to this problem of dependencies, which is Poetry, the Python tool, which I think is awesome. There's a lot of ways to solve this problem in Python, but I feel like they're all just solve part of the problem or need to be combined, and Poetry tries to solve the whole thing. I'm going to show you how to use it. It's pretty quick, to be honest, and some of the other benefits to using Poetry. And then I'll talk about why Python has this issue and how Poetry can help, how in the extreme case, containers can help isolation, and just how and why I think we need this tool, Poetry, Python. So what is a virtual environment and why do you need it? That's the big question, right? It's not strictly a Python thing. Like, you can have this problem in Java or many languages. Like in Java, you can have a diamond dependency conflict, right? So say I have one program and brings in two dependencies, and both these dependencies depend on some third-party library, XML parsing library, right? But they use different versions of it. And those different versions, say, have some sort of incompatibility. So I want to use these two things, but they need to pull in these two things. And it's not possible to have these both call their own versions of that library, right? So it becomes a diamond. So this happens in Java. It can happen in a lot of places, right? In Python, it's worse. And the reason why is in Java, that has to be in the same program, right? But in Python, by default, packages, dependencies are global, right? So it doesn't just have to be one program. It could be two completely separate programs using two versions of a package. That's not going to work, right? The easiest way for me to show you that is like this. Let's look at my code. Here I am in my little sample directory where I'm going to show you some things. If I run pip list, then it lists all the Python packages that I have installed, right? And I've had this computer for like a week, and there's quite a list of them, and they're all one specific version. And if I have to install something that needs a different version, that's going to be a little bit of a problem. There could be incompatibilities. So virtual environments are a way around that solution. There are different tools you can use to create and manage virtual environments in Python. One of the first ones was virtualenv. It's been around for a while, but it is largely superseded by what came next, which is venv. venv comes built in with Python 3.3 and higher, and it allows you to easily create virtual environments. It doesn't offer dependency management. So with venv, you can start a virtual environment and you're inside of it. And then inside there, you use pip to install the packages that you need. And then inside that environment, you won't have conflicts with that global list that I showed you earlier. Hopefully that's not confusing. It's going to make more sense as we go. Trust me. PyEnv specifically focused on managing the versions of Python, right? So what if my Mac comes with Python 2, but I need Python 3 for 3.11 for this project and 3.8 for this project? How do I keep track of all those Python interpreter versions? PyEnv helped with that. And then came pipenv. Pipenv is a little bit hard to say, but it's a combination of pip and the virtual environment and PyEnv, so that you can have virtual environments that point to a specific Python version and, have certain packages in them. And then things keep going from there, right? All of these solutions only help with Python packages, which is great, but what if you have some sort of C library that you depend on? What if you're a data science person, you're doing some sort of CUDA stuff on the GPU, crazy C++ stuff? It's not going to work to just use pyenv. And so that's where Conda came from. It's a package manager that is used a lot in data science, to my understanding. I've never actually used it, but the tool I want to talk about today is Poetry. Poetry is an all-in-one tool for virtual environments, for dependency management, for even packaging and distribution. So packaging up my code and putting it up on PyPy where people could use it. It simplifies a lot of tasks. It provides a nice out-of-the-box solution if you're getting started from scratch, greenfield development. I think it's totally the way to go. So yeah, let me walk you through that. Okay, first thing to do is you need to install Poetry. So for that, I just use pip install Poetry. You got to spell it right, like that. You can see it has a lot of dependencies, but there you go. It is installed. Once it's installed, I'm going to focus on just like a greenfield project. So we're starting from scratch, and you just use new. So I'm going to do Poetry new weather update app. Actually, the app that I'm building doesn't actually matter because we're going to be focused mainly on the packaging, but I'm building a library which you can use to get updates on the weather. And when I run that, right, you can see over here, ignore some of my other blah projects, but it created this new project, weather update. In it, it created two packages, one for tests, one for weather update. It created this blank initpy in each of them, and it created this project.toml, which we'll go into. Actually, let's go into it now. So it has all these various sections that you can add things to, and you can see all the Poetry ones are under tool.poetry. It sets up a name, a version. It's gotten my author name from somewhere, created a README. It's told Poetry that for this project, we need to use Python 3.11, and it has some other build system stuff, which I don't totally understand. But once we have this set up, we have this nice package structure, right? It's easy to add dependencies to it. So instead of using like a requirements.txt process and like piping that into pip, we can just do this. We're going to add a request. Ooh, interesting. Where are we? Okay, we're going to have to change into our folder, and then we're going to add requests. And we can see here that it installed requests, and then there was some dependencies of requests. And then if we look here, right, we can see it's picked a specific version of requests, right? So this is how I add a dependency to my project if I'm using Poetry. Once I have all my dependencies in there, the next thing I need to do, is install them. So I go to Poetry install. Then it says installing dependencies from lock file, and then it creates my lock file, which we can see here, right? So now it's locked down the specific versions that it's using of these based on a SHA. There we go. There's our requests along with all the dependencies that it depends upon. All right, so that's our lock file. You want to make sure that when you commit this code, you're going to put this lock file also in source control so that whoever's using this is going to use the same version. So once we add all our dependencies like that, we would add our code, we probably have a main.py, who knows what else, a bunch of tests, and add all the dependencies using the command line. And then to run things, we would set up a virtual environment, right? So in Poetry, we can do Poetry env, and there's a bunch of commands we can run there, including info. So when we wrote Poetry env info, it tells us where our Poetry environment is set up. You can see it's created this virtual environment in this cache folder. You can change this. Some people like it to be inside of their project in like a .vmp folder. I'm going to leave it here. And then here's our Python executable. And once we have that set up, we can go inside of it by typing Poetry shell. And now, remember I was saying how these virtual environments let us get a local package context, right? So we don't have all those global packages. We just have our local list, so that if I'm in here and I run pip list, all I see is the packages that have been added by Poetry. That's it, right? And similarly, right? If my main version of Python on Mac OS is Python 2, but here I've specified 3.1, then you can see it's also got that hooked up for me too, right? So it's providing this nice set of isolation. Yeah, what else can we do? So we may want to add tests, right? We already have our test folder. So we would do it, we add PyTest, but Poetry actually lets us group dependencies. And, we actually, I think that's the syntax. Let's see what happens. Oh, see, there's a deprecated, I should say, group dev, but dev does work. So now if we look at our TOML file here, let me see. Now we have dev dependencies, right? So it's a separate group of dependencies just for dev, because to run this, you don't actually need the Python project just to build it. I mean, similarly, I like to use black as a formatter. We can install that. And this is how we just add dependencies, right? We add them here. We can remove them the same way. So we can remove requests, right? And this lets us manage them. So now requests is gone. Oh, those blank lines got in there. Now requests is gone. And this is the system, right? You add and remove dependencies using the Poetry command line, and then your environment has those locked down. And if you want to leave your virtual environment, you can just exit. Yeah, that's the basics that you need to know. But Poetry, it tries to be an all-encompassing tool. It has this project.toml, and with this, there's actually enough information that you can build packages and push them to PyPy. So to do that, you do like Poetry build, and that would build my project into a wheel. And then I could publish that. And yeah, I mean, I don't have the permission set up to actually push that, but in theory, I could push a package that way. And that's kind of one thing I like about Poetry. It's trying to be this all-encompassing tool that covers a lot of, just important project management things you do, right? It helped me set up this structure so that these packages would work nice when I import. When I use this package, I can import like weather update dot whatever. And it helps me package them up, and it has the virtual environment, and it lets me set up Python. It's kind of all inclusive. So I like that. One of the downsides of a environment like this, though, is they do take up space, right? So we can manage the virtual environments. So I can do Poetry env list. Here's the list of all the environments I have set up, right? And then I can remove this. If I'm moving on to another project, disk space is a little bit scarce. I could do this and remove. I have to copy this. And now my virtual environment is gone. You can see that by running list again, right? And then what happens if I go into a shell then? It has to recreate it, right? But it recreates it pretty fast for this particular example. And now I'm back inside, which I can see with my pip list. And now nothing is really set up. I think I have to do Poetry install. There we go. And now I've recreated my environment again, and I've got everything I need in there. So that's Poetry. That's the very basics of it. It's enough to get you started. I think if you're starting on a new project, it's a great way to go. There's reasons why I'm a big fan of Poetry, right? It forces you to be explicit about managing dependencies. I'm not just going to import something and then, pip install it and then forget to add it to the requirements.txt. And then later when I try to set things up on another computer, I'm like, what's going on? It says I don't have this package. It forces you to set up a virtual environment ahead of time so you don't eventually run into this conflicting packages problem. I would say if you're using it, try to remember to always activate your environments. Try to remember to commit your lock file, your project.toml file. Absolutely do that. And then when you're running tests, not just when you're running the code, but when you're running tests, make sure you're inside the package and in CI, right? When you run things in CI, you want to also be inside this virtual environment. And that way you can be sure that everything's running the same everywhere. You might be wondering, as I mentioned at the beginning, why do we even need virtual environments for Python? Is it because Python's interpreted? If you've worked in other programming languages like, Rust, Go, C#, Java, you probably haven't quite had the same problems. And those programming languages, especially Rust and Go, are ahead of time compiled, right? And this does make this problem less likely to occur. If my Rust program requires a bunch of different stuff that it imports, when it compiles it, it's going to statically link those dependencies. Same in Go, right? Besides a couple exceptions like libc, when I have a Go program and I bring in dependencies, I'm going to statically link those into a fat binary, as they call it, like an executable with all the dependencies in it. When it does that, it can run into problems of not finding the right package, but that only has to happen once, right? At compile time. Whereas with Python, because it's interpreted, it needs to find the packages at runtime. So that is a contributing factor to why Python needs virtual environments. But there are other interpreted runtimes that don't have this issue, right? In Node.js, it's possible to set up local packages. They don't have to be global, right? In Ruby, it's possible to have gems, local gems to your project. The reason Python hits this problem is because Python by default does global packaging, right? And the virtual environment is a way to work around that. Now, this isn't Python's fault, right? A lot of the solutions that I just discussed, they're things that have been discovered. Python's been around since 1991. Node.js, Go, Rust, none of those existed at the time. And Python helped make developer experience of software development a lot better in a lot of ways, including having PyPy. But some of these other things, like great tooling for dealing with a package manager and having packages local to your specific solution, and they came about mainly afterwards. And so that's why I kind of like Poetry, because I think it's an attempt to take this more modern way of keeping packages local and having more tooling that helps you set up your project, that helps you build it, that helps you package it, more aggressive tooling that's more helpful. Poetry is just bringing that idea to Python, right? And you may say, okay, there's a whole bunch of ways to do virtual environments in Python. We're just adding one more. We're further splitting things up. And I mean, I think that is a risk with a new tool, is it's just one more way to do something. But my hope is that the way that Poetry works and helps you get started with your projects, helps you manage packages, helps you build. I think that if we can all come together on it, that it can bring Python into a better place. Yeah, so that's Poetry. Please use it, and it will help you solve a lot of your problems. The problem it won't help you solve is if you have dependencies that are C-based or dependencies that are written in another programming language. If you need to call, say, a different interpreter that's not Python, then it's not going to help you manage that. Or if you need to bring in a dependency that is not Python. For instance, I have a project that uses ImageMagick, and it needs a specific version of it. ImageMagick, is a complicated piece of software as I understand it. And I have another project that needs a different version of ImageMagick. And like that problem is just not possible to be solved with Poetry. Once you get to system level dependencies or other languages dependencies, it's time to look at containers as a way to package things up. So I would suggest using Poetry to wrap up your Python dependencies, but I would wrap the whole thing once you have multiple languages or dependencies that are outside of Python specifically in a container build system. The one I'd recommend is Earthly. I work for Earthly. Earthly lets you build your software inside of a container. And inside that container, a container is a lot like a virtual environment, but it's at the whole level of a Linux system. So the file system is isolated, and you can that way have specific versions of anything you desire that runs on Linux for that particular project. So that allows you to make sure that you are reproducible once you leave the bounds of working strictly in Python. If you're just in Python, and a lot of times you just use Poetry. It's a great tool. Both Poetry and Earthly are open source. And little side tangent, containers, like Docker containers, are very similar to virtual environments. So they let you abstract the whole Linux file system, but to do that, they need kernel support from the Linux kernel, and it gets a little bit more complicated. So it's great to have tools that can make it a little bit easier. That's what I do when I need to have two different Python programs that use two different versions of ImageMagick, or they need to pull in some dependency that is outside of the realm of interpreted code. Yeah, so this poetry video was inspired by somebody asking in another Python video to handle poetry. And that's how I actually got introduced to poetry, and I'm a big fan. So please leave in the comments what other types of videos you would like to see, and I'll keep making them. And check out Earthly, right? Earthly is a pretty cool tool. Yeah, thank you for watching.